The stars had not always looked like that. Yaya knew because her grandmother had told her, back when grandmothers still existed, back when telling stories around a fire meant warmth rather than survival. The stars used to be scattered, loose and wild and countless, the way spilled salt looks against a dark table. Now they were organized, ordered, arranged in the Galactic Council's administrative grid, each stellar cluster assigned a designation, each inhabited system catalogued and ranked and assigned a council liaison. The sky itself had been bureaucratized. Earth was designation XH0, the X stood for extinct. She pressed her back against the hull of the old transit pod and watched the grid through a crack in the corroded plating. The pod had been half buried in soil for so long that roots had threaded through its floor panels, splitting the composite in long, pale lines. She had cleared a viewing port with her knife 3 years ago when she first moved in, and every night since she had looked up at that rigid geometry of light and felt something she could not name. It was not exactly anger. Anger required the belief that something could be changed. This was older than anger. It lived in her chest like a splinter that had calcified. She pulled her cap down and closed her eyes. The cap was ridiculous. She knew that. A flat-brimmed thing, canvas, dark green, with a sun-bleached patch on the front that her grandmother had stitched there before Yaya could remember. The patch showed a bird in flight, wings spread, over a field of red and white stripes and a rectangle of blue. Nobody alive could tell her what country that flag had belonged to. The stitching was fading. She kept the cap anyway. She kept it because it was the only thing in the world that had belonged to someone who had loved her, and in the world that existed now, that made it the most valuable object she had ever touched. Outside, something large moved through the undergrowth. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, knife out, weight on the balls of her feet, listening. The movement came again, too heavy for a dog, too uneven for a patrol drone. She heard breathing ragged, wet, too loud. She already knew before she saw him. Lennox came through the tree line like a structure partially collapsed. He was enormous, had always been enormous, 2.5 meters of scar tissue and gentle eyes, and a brain that worked differently from most, had worked differently even before the Council's orbital bombardment had scrambled half the northern hemisphere's communication infrastructure, and fried roughly 1 in 8 of every human nervous system unlucky enough to be caught in the pulse wave. Lennox had been caught. He processed things slowly. He forgot words sometimes. He became overwhelmed in loud spaces and loud situations. None of this had ever made him less than who he was. Right now, who he was bleeding. She crossed to him in 3 steps and caught him before he went down. He outweighed her by 140 kilograms. She staggered but held, and they went down together in a managed collapse against the pod's hull, him seated and her braced against his shoulder. "The patrol," she said. "How many?" 4. He was looking at his hands. There was a long gash across his ribs where something had caught him. She could see the dull gleam of a scanner burn through the torn fabric of his jacket. Council standard. The enforcement division used them on runners. I was looking at the bird. "What bird?" "There was a bird. I have never seen that bird." She exhaled slowly through her nose. He had almost certainly stopped in the middle of running from an enforcement patrol to look at a bird. Was it a good bird? He considered this with the gravity it deserved. Very unusual coloring, black and yellow, some orange. Okay. She was already pulling the medical kit from the back of the pod. 3 months ago it had contained actual antibiotics. Now it contained bandages, a cauterizing strip, 2 tablets of something she couldn't identify, and a partial bottle of alcohol. She tore the wrapping off the cauterizing strip with her teeth. "This is going to hurt." "I know." "Hold still." "I know that too." He held still. He always held still when she told him to. She worked fast, pressing the strip against the scanner burn, and he made one sound and then was quiet, jaw set, eyes fixed on the middle distance with the absolute calm of someone who had decided that pain was a thing happening to him rather than a thing he was required to react to. She had never seen anyone absorb pain like Lennox. She had asked him once how he did it. He had thought about it for a long time, and then said that pain was usually temporary, and most things that were temporary didn't require strong reactions. She had thought about that answer for months. "The patrol will have marked your biometric signature," she said when she was done. "We need to move." "I know. North toward the rubble fields." "They don't like the rubble fields. Because of the signal interference." "Because of the signal interference." She packed the kit. He stood slowly, testing his weight, and gave her a look that she had long ago learned to translate as, "I am fine. Please stop looking at me like that. I am fine." "The bird," he started. "You can tell me about the bird while we walk." He told her about the bird while they walked. The Earth that the Galactic Council had left behind was not dead. That was the thing that the Council had apparently not anticipated, or had anticipated and simply not cared about. When you obliterated a civilization and salted its atmosphere and shattered its coastal cities with tidal wave generators, the planet itself did not register this as anything more than a minor inconvenience. 4,000 years of regeneration had turned most of what had once been human territory into something extraordinary and strange. The forests had come back first, and then the animals, and then things that were neither forests nor animals but something new, species adapted to the particular cocktail of atmospheric residue and cosmic radiation that the bombardment had left behind. Life was generous in ways that weapons designers never accounted for. Yaya had grown up in this world. She knew it the way you knew a complicated person, not its entirety, not its logic, just its textures. The way certain plants glowed faintly at the base of their stems in the hour before dawn. The way the ruins of human cities had been absorbed but not erased, their geometry still visible as slight regularity in the chaos of growth. A concrete wall swallowed in vine, a road reduced to a faint straightness in an otherwise curved landscape, a tower collapsed to a mound but still somehow pointing. The ruins were everywhere once you knew what to look for. She had learned to use them as a compass. She had also learned to use them as a reminder. The Galactic Council maintained a modest presence on Earth. Modest by their standards, which meant orbital relay stations, 3 surface installations, and a rotating garrison of maybe 800 enforcement officers. The surface installations were what mattered. They were there to prevent any remaining human population from doing anything the Council classified as unauthorized technological development, which meant in practice anything that looked like it might eventually become a weapon, a ship drive, or a communications transmitter. The Council was not especially worried about humans. Humans had been extinct for 4,000 years, but the Council was thorough. Thoroughness was how you maintained a galactic order that stretched across 11,000 inhabited systems. You didn't leave loose ends. You checked your work. The humans they occasionally found were classified as biological remnants, feral populations. The Council's official position was that they were of ethnographic interest and should be preserved in their current state, which meant alive but pre-technological, harmless, monitored from a distance. This official position had a gap in it the size of a hull breach. Monitored from a distance did not include what the individual enforcement officers did when they encountered these biological remnants in the field, away from sensors, away from record. Yaya had seen what they did. She did not think about it often. Thinking about it required a kind of sustained focus that could tip over into something corrosive if she wasn't careful. She kept it in a compartment and she worked. She moved, she scavenged, she built. She protected Lennox and Lennox protected her, and together they moved through the world with the particular efficiency of 2 people who have long since stopped debating whether survival is worth the effort and simply gotten on with surviving. The rubble fields began 2 kilometers north of the pod. They had been the administrative center of a city once. She knew the shape of it from the foundations, could feel the ghost of grid planning in the way the debris was distributed. The Council's enforcement drones struggled here because the ferrous content in the shattered infrastructure interfered with their navigation systems. It gave Yaya maybe a 30-second advantage if she was running. She had measured it. 30 seconds was enough. She had spent a great deal of her life measuring things like that. The gap in a patrol rotation, the height of a sensor antenna, the carrying capacity of a particular beam before it shifted. The ruins were full of useful data if you learned to read them as systems rather than wreckage. Most people who found themselves living among the remnants of a destroyed civilization tended to treat those remnants as either obstacles or irrelevant background. Yaya had learned early, from watching her grandmother, that they were neither. They were instructions. Everything that had been built by someone solving a problem, and the solutions were still visible in the rubble even when the problems themselves were 4,000 years buried. Her grandmother had called it archaeology with urgency. Yaya had called it staying alive. She moved through the familiar geometry of broken streets and sunken foundations with Lennox behind her, his footsteps heavier and more deliberate on the uneven ground, occasionally pausing to step around a root system that had pushed up through cracked concrete. The moon was mostly blocked by cloud cover, and she navigated by what she knew rather than what she could see, which was a kind of trust she extended to very few things: the ground, Lennox, her own sense of direction, and the knowledge that the people who built this city had laid it out on a grid, and the grid was still there underneath everything if you felt for it. She felt for it. They moved north. They came around the edge of a collapsed overpass at midnight and found the others. There were 7 of them, clustered around a fire they had built inside a shattered concrete basin, so the light wouldn't be visible from above. 3 women, 4 men, ranging in apparent age from early 20s to one person who was visibly old, with the particular look of someone who had earned their age the hard way. They all went still when Yaya and Lennox appeared. 3 of them had weapons raised before Yaya had covered 2 steps. "We're not enforcement," she said. Her hands were out. "She's got a ration pack from Installation 2, said one of the women, looking at the pack on Yaya's back. Low, cautious voice. "How did you get an Installation 2 ration pack?" "I took it from someone who had one." A beat, the weapons did not lower. "I took it," Yaya said, "from an enforcement officer." The weapons came down, not all the way but enough. The old person by the fire, she identified as a woman eventually, once the firelight settled, looked at Yaya with eyes that were doing a great deal of rapid calculation. Sharp. Someone who had survived a long time by being smarter than the situation she found herself in. "Sit down," the old woman said. "Don't touch anything." Her name was Myra. The others were hers, not in a formal sense, but in the way that sometimes happens in dangerous places, where one person becomes the fixed point that others orient themselves around. Myra had been born on Earth, which meant she was at least old enough to have been born before the Council's last culling sweep 30 years ago, which meant she had survived things Yaya couldn't fully imagine. She had the hands of someone who had built things, repaired things, dismantled things. She also had, tucked against the back wall of the concrete basin, covered under a sheet of corrugated polymer, something that made Yaya's chest seize when she saw it. A transmitter. Old, jury-rigged, built from a dozen different generations of scavenged components soldered into functional conversation with one another in ways that would have horrified any engineer who valued elegance. But functional. Yaya could tell it was functional because the indicator light on the main board was breathing, faint, slow, cycling on and off like something alive and patient. "You're broadcasting," Yaya said. "Trying to," Myra said. "To where?" "That is," Myra said, "the question I have been working on for 15 years. She explained it calmly, without drama. 15 years ago, Myra had found a pre-bombardment data cache buried under 3 meters of sediment in what had once been a government facility. Most of it was corrupted. What survived told her things that had not been told to any human living in the 4,000 years since the Galactic Council's fleet arrived at Earth and did what it did. Chief among those things, humanity was not extinct. Yaya sat with that for a moment. She had grown up with the assumption of extinction the way you grew up with gravity, not as a belief you had chosen, but as a property of the world that required no argument. They were the last, the scattered remnants of a species the universe had decided to edit out. Everything she had ever done had been done inside that assumption. Every plan she made, every risk she calculated, every night she had looked up at the organized stars and felt the thing in her chest that she couldn't name. She had worked hard, survived hard, lived with purpose, and all of it had been oriented around the center of a void. The knowledge that there was no larger story, no context, no one keeping count. She had not known there was another possibility. The Council had destroyed Earth. But in the 200 years between the Council's first observation of humanity and the bombardment, humanity had sent ships out, exploratory missions, colony ships. The early ones had been tentative, small, the kind of ventures that large civilizations launch with the confidence that they will be irrelevant because surely nothing bad is coming. Then the Council's observation fleet had been detected, and the nature of the missions changed. They became desperate. They became fast. They became everything: the last libraries, the last seed banks, the last people who could be put on ships and aimed at the dark with the instruction, survive, tell someone, come back. Some had been intercepted and destroyed. But some, the Council's own classified records confirmed this, had escaped into deep space before the bombardment was complete. The Council had classified them as lost. They had added a notation to the file: no pursuit warranted, subject's technology insufficient for return, threat assessment negligible. 4,000 years was a long time. Yaya looked at Myra. The notation, she said, threat assessment negligible. That was 4,000 years ago. Yes. Based on technology, 4,000 years ago. Based, Myra said, with the precision of someone who had spent 15 years living inside this particular fact, on technology that the people on those ships took with them, and have had 4,000 years to develop, without any council oversight, without any suppression programs, without anyone monitoring their progress and ensuring they remained pre-technological. She let that sit. The council checked their work once, 4,000 years ago, and then they stopped looking. One of the others by the fire made a low sound, not quite a laugh, something in the register between humor and awe. They stopped looking, Lennox said, very carefully, as though testing whether he had understood correctly. They stopped looking, Myra confirmed. You think they're out there, Lennox said. He was not asking. I think they've been out there, Myra said, for 4,000 years, and I think the council stopped worrying about them sometime around year 300, and I think whatever those ships became in 4,000 years is something the council has not accounted for. She looked at the transmitter. The light breathed on and off. The signal has to reach a certain range before anyone will pick it up. The installations are jamming a radius of about 1,200 kilometers. I need to get the transmitter to higher elevation to punch through the jamming envelope. The peak, she gestured north, at what Yaya knew was a ridge line, the collapsed spine of what had once been a mountain before the tidal generators had reshaped the coastline. I need to get it up there. I've been trying to get a team together to carry it. The enforcement garrison will see you coming, Yaya said. Yes. You need a distraction. I need, Myra said, several things, but yes, that is one of them. Yaya looked at Lennox. Lennox looked back at her with his usual expression, which contained multitudes but was mostly composed of a patient readiness to do whatever needed doing. She had seen him carry a collapsed section of roof off a trapped stranger once, alone, without asking for help or recognition. She had seen him stand between a frightened child and an enforcement officer, and simply not move, no matter what the officer threatened. the way a mountain doesn't move in response to being yelled at. "We'll do the distraction," she said. Myra studied her. "You don't know what I'm asking you to do yet. I know you need people who can move fast and draw attention. I know the rubble fields. I know the enforcement patrol patterns here because I've been watching them for 3 years." She pulled off her cap and turned it over in her hands, looking at the faded patch. "And I know that if there are humans out there in the dark and they've had 4,000 years to figure out how angry they should be, I want them to hear us." She put the cap back on. "Tell me the rest," she said. The plan had the messy beauty of improvised things. Myra's team would carry the transmitter up the eastern approach to the ridge, which was the blind spot in the enforcement network. Not because the council had missed it, but because the terrain was genuinely impassable, a broken field of collapsed infrastructure that descended in random 40-degree angles toward a subsidence crater 300 meters wide. Her people would move at first light, when the drone rotation gave them a 12-minute gap in continuous coverage. 12 minutes to cover 600 meters of broken ground, carrying 80 kilos of assembled electronics. Yaya and Lennox would be 2 kilometers to the west, at the edge of the Installation 2 security perimeter, making a great deal of noise. What kind of noise, specifically, was what Yaya spent the remaining hours before dawn working out. She used the concrete basin. Myra's people had cleared a low table from a piece of shattered panel, and Yaya took it and laid out everything she had: the thermal emitters, the salvaged frequency board, the partial schematics she had been carrying in her pack for 6 months without knowing exactly what she was building them for. She arranged them in silence. One of Myra's people sat across from her after a while, a man her age or close to it, with steady hands and the careful attention of someone who had learned things the hard way and valued what he knew because of that. His name was Dar. "I know that frequency board," he said, looking at it without touching. "What do you know about it?" "It's from an Installation 2 service drone, the ones they use for perimeter maintenance." He looked at her. "How did you get the frequency board out of an Installation 2 service drone?" "I waited until it came near enough, and then I took it." He looked at her for a moment. "It can mimic the drone's own signal output. If you run it through the emitter on the right gain setting, the network will read it as a rogue maintenance drone rather than an unauthorized human transmitter." "That's what I was counting on," Yaya said. "How do you know that?" "I used to work on those drones," Dar said, "before I stopped." "You worked for the installation?" "For 2 years, long enough to learn things." He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone who had made a decision that cost them something and had not stopped being aware of the cost, but had also not regretted the decision. "They classified us as biological remnants with cooperative status, gave us rations, gave us shelter." He paused. "Gave us nothing else, would not give us anything else. Cooperative status meant useful until you were not useful, and then you went back to remnant." "When did you leave?" "When a colleague asked a question they didn't like." He didn't elaborate. He picked up the frequency board and turned it in his hands. "I can calibrate this properly. It will give you an extra 30 seconds of masking before the system recognizes the anomaly." 30 seconds on top of 30 seconds was a minute. A minute was significant. "Do it," Yaya said. He did it. They worked in quiet companionship through the remaining darkness, making the thing better than either of them could have made it alone, which was the kind of collaboration that Yaya had rarely been able to have, because collaboration required trust and trust required time, and time was always the thing she was shortest on. She noted it carefully, the specific quality of working alongside someone who understood what she was building without needing it explained. Filed it away. It was the kind of thing worth remembering. Yaya and Lennox would be 2 kilometers to the west, at the edge of the Installation 2 security perimeter, making a great deal of noise. She was ready. She did it the way she did everything, methodically, without waste, testing each element in her mind before committing to it. She had grown up scavenging the ruins of a technological civilization without the education to understand most of what she found, and she had compensated by developing a powerful intuition for how things worked, a feel for function that her grandmother had called a gift, and which Yaya privately thought was just what happened when you had no choice but to pay attention. She had pieces. She had time. She had Lennox, who could not always track complex plans but who executed with absolute fidelity any instruction you gave him clearly and simply and trusted him to follow. She explained the plan to him 3 times. He listened each time with equal attention, because he did not assume that a repeated explanation was condescension. He just wanted to understand it right. "The part where we run," he said. "Yes. We will definitely have to run fast. Faster than we've run before, probably." He nodded. He turned this over with his usual thoroughness. "The bird I saw earlier," he said finally, "black and yellow and orange. I looked it up in the picture book." She kept an illustrated field guide she'd found in the ruins pre-bombardment, a guide to birds of the Mediterranean. Lennox loved it. He had memorized most of it. "What is it?" "It's called a golden oriole. It says they migrate. They travel thousands of kilometers." He looked at his hands. "They always come back to the same places. Even after a long time, the same trees." "Yeah," she said softly. "They were here before us," he said. "They will be here after, but right now we are here too." He seemed satisfied by this. "I think that is good." She thought about the colony ships. 4,000 years in the dark. 4,000 years of compounding grief and compounding adaptation and compounding ingenuity, all pointed away from the one thing that had always pulled them. She thought about what that did to people over generations, whether it hardened them or hollowed them or made them into something that no longer recognized itself in what it had been. She thought about what it would mean, after 4,000 years, to hear a signal from home. "Yeah," she said, "I think that's good too." They went at first light. The western perimeter of Installation 2 was guarded by a sensor net, 2 permanent emplacements, and a rotating pair of enforcement officers who walked a circuit of roughly 200 meters every 20 minutes. The enforcement officers of the Galactic Council were not, by and large, especially attentive. This was not their fault. They had been assigned to a planet classified as containing only feral pre-technological remnants, rotating on a posting that even their own command structure acknowledged was a bureaucratic formality, which meant that after the first 6 months of diligent patrol their attention had drifted toward the comfortable assumption that nothing would ever happen here. Assumption was the most exploitable vulnerability Yaya knew. She had already placed the first charge, not explosive, nothing so dramatic, a simple thermal emitter she had built from scavenged components that would produce a heat signature the sensor net would classify as an unauthorized fire, at the base of the perimeter fence before Lennox was in position. She gave him 20 seconds, then she lit it. The response was immediate and entirely predictable. The 2 enforcement officers broke their circuit. The drone overhead banked toward the anomaly. The installation's external alert shifted from passive to active monitoring, which in practical terms meant the garrison's attention was suddenly, entirely here. Yaya was already moving. The secondary charge was prepositioned 200 meters east. She reached it in 43 seconds, which was better than she had timed it, because she was lighter without the pack, and because she had mapped this ground in the dark 100 times and could run it with her eyes effectively closed. She set the second emitter. This one was designed to look like a communications attempt, a specific frequency that she had identified from studying the Council's own intercept records, the one they had designated as unauthorized technological activity, the one that guaranteed maximum response. She heard the garrison's external speakers crackle, and then a voice speaking in Galactic Standard, which she understood because Myra had taught her, because knowledge was the other thing you scavenged. Biological remnants detected in proximity to installation perimeter. All units, containment formation. All units. She ran. Lennox emerged from the rubble field on her left like something tidal, vast and low and unstoppable, moving at the ground-eating lope that his long legs made possible when he stopped trying to be small. He reached her in 4 seconds and they ran together, which they had done 1,000 times, and the rhythm of it was as familiar as breathing. She navigated, fast and precise, reading the ground 10 meters ahead. He followed her line exactly, trusting her eyes, adding his mass to their momentum, and when she glanced back over her shoulder, the entire western perimeter of Installation 2 was lit up and moving toward them. Good. Every unit moving toward them was not moving toward the eastern approach. She ran. The installation's exterior lights had all rotated to face the western perimeter. She could see them even from here, the cold blue-white of Council standard illumination sweeping across the tree line in disciplined arcs, and she felt the old familiar arithmetic of pursuit, the gap between what they could see and where she was, the rate at which that gap was closing, the geometry of escape routes laid over the terrain she had memorized. Running from enforcement had always felt to her less like panic than like a proof. You either had done the work of knowing the ground or you had not. She had done the work. She had never been caught. Not once in all the years of running from enforcement patrols, not since the first time at age 7, when a patrol had come through the sector where she and her grandmother lived, and she had learned, from her grandmother's absolute and silent stillness, what pursued humans were supposed to do. Her grandmother had moved like water around rocks, not running, not freezing, but flowing into the negative spaces that the patrol's attention left behind. She had pressed Yaya against a wall in a dark corner and put one finger to her lips, and they had not breath for 4 minutes while the patrol's footsteps moved past and away. Afterward, her grandmother had not said anything dramatic. She had simply squeezed Yaya's hand once and started walking. Her grandmother had been caught eventually. Yaya had not been there. She preferred not to think about the specific shape of that particular loss. She ran. The drones were faster. She knew the drones were faster. The plan did not require them to outrun the drones. It required them to stay in the interference zone long enough for Myra to reach the ridge line, which meant keeping the garrison engaged for 12 minutes. Yaya had counted on perhaps 9 of those minutes in the open, drawing pursuit, and then 3 in the deep rubble field where the drones lost their navigation. She was at 6 minutes when Lennox went down. She heard it, the change in his footfall behind her, the half-second pause that meant his weight had shifted wrong, and then the impact, heavy and final, and she was turning before she had decided to turn, because that was the other thing about running with someone for years. Your body learned their rhythms, and when the rhythm broke, it broke in you too. He was on his side. His jacket was torn open at the shoulder, not a scanner burn this time, a physical impact, one of the rubble field's irregular surface breaks that you couldn't see until you were on it. The shoulder was dislocated. She could see the geometry of it even in the low pre-dawn light. He was trying to get up. "Stop," she said. "I am fine." "Your shoulder is out. Stop moving it or you'll damage the joint." He stopped. He looked at the sky. One of the drones was circling, losing its lock in the interference but not gone. She had 9 seconds before it reacquired. There was a specific thing you did with a dislocated shoulder if you knew how. Her grandmother had known how. She had watched it done once. She did it now, in the 9 seconds she had, on her knees in the rubble, and it required a particular quality of focused calm that she only found in the absolute middle of situations where there was no room for anything except the next correct action. Lennox made a sound. The joint went back. "Up," she said. He was up. 7 minutes 40, close enough. They went into the deep rubble field and the drone lost them, and for a long moment there was just the sound of their breathing and the distant organized commotion of an enforcement garrison running a containment sweep through the wrong sector. To the east, invisible and inaudible at this distance, Myra was on the ridge. Yaya pressed her back against a wall of broken concrete and looked up through a gap in the rubble at the organized stars. The council's grid, neat, administered, assigned. Her chest did the thing it always did, the thing she couldn't name. She took off her cap and held it in both hands, looking at the faded patch. She thought, if you are out there, we are here. We have always been here. We are still here. We are still us. The transmitter signal, when Myra activated it from the ridge, was a single repeating burst on a frequency that the council's jamming network was not calibrated to suppress. Because it was not a frequency that any surviving human should theoretically have had access to. Because it was a frequency used exclusively in pre-bombardment deep space communication protocols. The kind that was only useful if you were trying to reach something very far away. Myra had found the specification in the data cache. She had spent 15 years learning how to build a device that could produce it. The signal traveled at the speed of light. It would take time to reach anything. But it was out. They did not discuss what would happen next, because what would happen next was not something any of them could plan for or control. They had done the only thing they could do. They had spoken into the dark. The dark would answer or it would not. It answered in 43 days. Not with a message, with a silence. The orbital relay stations that maintained the Council's jamming envelope around Earth went offline one by one, in a sequence that started at the outer ring and moved inward with methodical precision. Yaya was watching the sky when it happened. She watched the hard points of the relay stations' running lights go dark in sequence, like someone walking through a room turning off lights, calm and purposeful. The garrison at Installation 2 went to emergency alert. The garrison at Installation 2 then went to nothing. She watched that too. The emergency lights, the commotion of rapid evacuation preparation, the hasty liftoff of the garrison's 2 transport craft, rising on their drive columns toward orbit. She watched them reach the upper atmosphere. She watched them not arrive. For a long time after that there was silence. Then the sky changed. She had never seen anything like it. Nobody alive had seen anything like it. Myra stood beside her in the rubble field, and for once the old woman was not calculating anything. She was just watching. Lennox was behind them both, very still, looking up, and his expression had the quality it got when he encountered something that his categories couldn't contain: open, honest, a little overwhelmed. Ships, coming down through the atmosphere in a controlled cascade, entry plasma streaming from their hulls in long curved arcs of orange and red, and there were many of them, many more than Yaya had frame of reference to count, so she stopped trying to count and just watched. They came down over the horizon to the north and east and west, and eventually almost directly above, and the sound arrived after the light as it always did. A deep sustained resonance that she felt in the bones of her chest before she heard it with her ears. They had come home. The first ship landed 4 kilometers north, in the ruins of what the field guide told her had once been a large city. She could see the landing struts settle, the ramps extend. She could see movement at the ramp's base, figures emerging, and they were human figures unmistakably, even at this distance. Bipedal, the right proportions, moving with a human gait, but they moved with a quality she couldn't immediately name, a particular purposefulness, the kind of movement that belonged to people who had been heading somewhere for a very long time and had finally arrived. More ramps extended from more ships. The figures multiplied. She watched them stand at the base of the ramps and look out at the jungle, at the ruins, at the sky above them that was no longer the organized grid. She watched them reach down and touch the ground. She saw that even at this distance. Saw the way they crouched and pressed their hands flat against the soil, and stayed there for a moment that went on longer than was strictly necessary. They were touching the earth for the first time. Some of them, certainly for most of them, even if their grandparents and great-grandparents and the 100 generations before that had told them about it, had preserved images and maps, and the words for what it felt like. Nothing prepared you for the actual texture, the actual weight of air that had been on this planet since the planet formed, the actual smell of soil that had been cycling through life and death for longer than any human civilization had existed. You couldn't be told that. You had to press your hand to it. She understood, watching, that she had been doing the same thing her entire life, touching the ground, reading the ruins, feeling for the grid beneath the growth, and she had not known what it meant until this moment. It meant she was part of a sequence. She was not the end of something. She was a middle part, an unbroken thread, and the people walking down those ramps were also a middle part. And what happened from here was the rest of the sentence that the ships had carried out there 40 centuries ago and were only now finishing. Myra made a sound. Yaya looked at her. The old woman was crying, and she was not someone who cried. She was not apologizing for it either. Yaya felt the thing in her chest shift, the old splinter, the calcified anger that was older than anger. She felt it move for the first time in her life, felt it working loose from whatever tissue it had grown into, and what came up in its place was not what she expected. Not rage, not grief. She put her cap on. She started walking. The figure who met her at the edge of the landing zone was a woman in her middle years, dark-haired, with the look of someone carrying 4,000 years of inherited purpose, as if it were the most ordinary burden in the world. She wore a uniform Yaya didn't recognize, not the council's architecture of function and suppression, but something that had evolved its own logic over millennia, still carrying faint echoes of what human clothing had once looked like, adapted and adapted again by generations who had never stopped thinking of themselves as the people who were going back someday. She looked at Yaya, she looked at the cap, she looked at the faded patch. Her expression changed. "We got your signal," she said, in English, which had survived somehow, changed but recognizable, and hearing it said aloud by a stranger's voice did something to Yaya's chest that she was not going to examine right now. "I know," Yaya said. "I sent it. You sent it. Me and some others." The woman looked past her at Myra and at Lennox, who had stopped a few meters back and was looking at the ships with the expression of someone who has just had a category updated. The woman looked at all of them for a long moment, this small band of survivors in their worn clothes with their scavenged tools and their patched symbols and their extraordinary, unreasonable persistence. "We weren't sure there would be anyone left," she said. "There are always some left," Yaya said. "There are always some who didn't get caught." The woman looked at her. Something passed across her face, recognition, or the echo of it, the sense of seeing something she had been taught about, had grown up with the idea of, and had never expected to actually encounter. "My name is Commander Cira Vasquez," she said. "Fifth Fleet Reunification Division." Yaya said. A pause. "What do you need?" Yaya thought about the question. It was a large question. It contained the ruins of an entire civilization and 4,000 years of silence, and every scavenged meal and every cold night, and every time she had looked up at the organized stars and felt the splinter. It contained Myra's 15 years and her grandmother's stories, and the field guide with its pictures of birds that migrated thousands of kilometers and always came back to the same trees. "Show me what you've built," she said. "While you were out there, show me what you made." The commander held her gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and gestured at the ramp. They walked up together. The first thing Yaya saw inside the ship was a screen. On the screen was a map, not the council's administrative grid, not the neat imposed geometry of a bureaucratized sky, but something organic and enormous and blazing with detail. A map of 4,000 years of human movement through the galaxy, the routes and the stations and the settlements and the battles and the losses and the rebuildings, all of it charted in colors she had never seen on any human-made object before. Colors that must have been developed somewhere out there in the long dark, by people who needed new words for what they were seeing. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Behind her she heard Lennox say, very quietly to someone she didn't know, "She is the one who made the plan." A pause, in which she imagined whoever he was talking to making some sound of acknowledgement. "She is very good at plans, and very fast. You have to keep up." She didn't turn around. She was still looking at the map. The council had been moving since the signal was received. She knew this because Commander Vasquez had briefed her, quickly and without softening, in the corridor outside the navigation room. The council had begun mobilizing a response fleet as soon as the Fifth Fleet's approach was detected. The Fifth Fleet was the advance element. The larger formation was 2 weeks behind. The council had more ships. The council had more time, more infrastructure, more administered stability. What they did not have, Vasquez had said, with a kind of plain certainty that Yaya found immediately credible, was 4,000 years of having been told they were finished. There was a particular quality to people who had been told they were finished and had declined to be. Yaya turned away from the map. "Tell me about your weapon systems," she said. Vasquez started to answer. Yaya stopped her. "No, wait." She went to the communications console. She found the channel that was still broadcasting the original signal, Myra's signal, still cycling from the ridge because Myra had built it to cycle until someone told it to stop. She opened a broader channel alongside it. She looked at the operator. "Does this reach the planet's surface? All of it?" "All of it," the operator confirmed. She thought about what to say. She thought about it for exactly the time it took to put her cap on straight, settle it on her head, and look at the screen. "This is Yaya," she said. "I don't know your names. I don't know how many of you there are. I know some of you have been hiding for a long time. I know some of you have stopped hoping." She paused. "The ships are real. Look north, look east. They are coming down, and they are ours, and they are here." She paused again. She was not a speechmaker. She had never wanted to be. "You do not have to come out right now. You don't have to do anything you're not ready to do. But if you are ready," she touched the brim of her cap, a gesture that meant nothing to anyone watching and everything to her, "come to the ships. We have work to do." She closed the channel. Outside, through the viewport, she could see the forest, the old ruins beneath the green. She could see, if she looked carefully, the faint regularity of old roads in the uneven floor of the jungle, the ghost geometry of what had been. And above the forest, above the ruins and the growth, the sky was full of ships, her ships, human ships, and they were still coming down. There were more of them than she had realized. She thought of the golden oriole, black and yellow and some orange. Thousands of kilometers, and they always came back to the same trees. Lennox appeared beside her. He looked out the viewport. He looked at the ships coming down through the red-streaked morning sky, and then he looked at the forest below, and then he looked at her. "The ships," he said, "they came. They came. Because of the signal. Because of the signal." He looked out the viewport again for a while. She waited. "I would like to see more birds," he said. "While we are here, there will be birds we have never seen." "Yes," she said, "there will be." She did not tell him that there might not be time for birds, that what was coming required everything they had, that the Council's response fleet was en route, and the window for establishing a defensible position on the planet's surface was finite and shrinking. She did not tell him this because he already knew it, in the way that he knew most things, slowly, thoroughly, in his own sequence, arriving at the same conclusions everyone else did, but by a different path that was entirely his own. And because he was right too, there would be birds. Whatever happened next, there would be birds. She had kept the field guide. It was in her pack. She had carried it the whole way from the pod to the rubble field to the ridge road to here, along with the medical kit and the tools and the 300 small things that keeping alive required. She had carried it because it was worth carrying, because it had pictures of real things, Because the golden oriole flew thousands of kilometers in the dark and came back to the same trees. Commander Vasquez came up beside them. She looked out at the ships and the forest, and the red sky brightening towards something that was not quite dawn yet, but was working on it. "The Council will want to know," she said carefully, "what our ground position is before the main fleet arrives. They'll target the landing zones first." "I know the landing zones," Yaya said. "I know the whole terrain. I've been walking it for 20 years. Vasquez looked at her. "You'd be willing to brief the tactical." "I'll do more than brief." She turned from the viewport. "You have 4,000 years of resources, and I have 20 years of knowing every meter of that ground. Between the two of us, we can figure out where to stand and what to do when they arrive." She started down the corridor. "Yaya," Vasquez said. She stopped. "We thought about coming back. For all 4,000 years we thought about it, every generation. We knew what we would find. We knew the Council had been here." She paused. "We weren't sure the fight would be worth it, whether there was anything left to come back to." Yaya considered this. "There are always some left," she said again. "There are always some who didn't get caught." She looked at the corridor around her, at the aged metal, the wear patterns of 4,000 years, the small marks left by generations of hands on surfaces meant to last. "And we have been here the whole time. We know every tree, every ruin, every interference pattern in every rubble field." She almost smiled. "You have the ships, we have the ground. I think together we will be difficult to move." She walked on. Behind her she heard Vasquez say, quietly to no one in particular, "Yeah, I think we will." Outside, the sky continued to fill. It went on filling for a long time. The Council's first response reached orbital range on the 11th day. It was not in the end a fleet. It was a diplomatic vessel, alone, broadcasting on every frequency it could reach, which was the specific kind of message that said, "We are not sure what we are dealing with and we want to talk before we find out." 4,000 years had changed humanity in ways the Council had not modeled. The Council was thorough, but thoroughness required accurate data, and the data they had was 4,000 years old. The diplomatic vessel was met by 500 ships. Yaya was not in the negotiating chamber. She had no interest in the negotiating chamber. She was outside in the forest, sitting on a piece of broken concrete that had once been part of something large and important, and was now just a good place to sit. She had the field guide open on her knee. She was showing it to a child, one of the first to come out of hiding after her broadcast, a small, serious person of indeterminate age who had been living in a drainage tunnel for what appeared to be several years, and who had opinions about everything. She had found the Oriole's page. "It says it migrates," the child said, reading slowly, working through the old words. "It does. It comes back to the same places. Every year." The child looked at the picture. It looked at the sky, where the ships hung in their dozens and their hundreds, occupying the orbital space that the Council's relay stations had occupied for so long. A different pattern, a human pattern, if you knew how to read it. "Is that what they did?" the child asked. "The ships, they migrated." Yaya thought about it. "Something like that," she said. "They went out, they stayed alive. They found ways to survive in new places. And when they finally heard that there was something to come back to," she touched the brim of her cap, the faded bird, the faded stripes, "they came back." The child looked at the book. It looked at the sky. It looked at the book again. "Will they stay?" it asked. "Yes," Yaya said. "This time they'll stay." The negotiations lasted 3 months. Yaya did not attend the negotiations. She was busy. There was a great deal to map, to document, to show the people who were coming down from the ships and learning to walk in the places their ancestors had walked, learning to read the ruins, learning the difference between what was lost and what was only buried. She walked them through rubble fields and reclaimed forests, and she showed them where the roads had been and where the walls still stood beneath the vines. She was a good guide. She knew the ground. Lennox walked with her, as he always had. He identified birds for anyone who wanted to know. He had an extraordinary memory for the field guide, and an eye for movement and foliage that nothing had ever trained him to have except long practice and genuine enthusiasm. He made people feel safe without trying to. He made the enormous, disorienting experience of arriving on a planet your family had not seen for 4,000 years feel slightly more manageable by simply being very large and very calm and occasionally saying, without preamble, "There, do you see? In the high branch, the striped one. That is a hoopoe. They are very unusual." The council's response, when it came, was a withdrawal of its claim to the XH designation and a reclassification of Earth's status in the administrative registry from extinct remnant to contested territory, pending further review. It was not, Myra said, over. It was the beginning of the part that required different tools. She was already building those tools. New transmitters, better range, designed not to call for help but to coordinate. She was teaching everyone who would learn. She sat in the ruins and in the ship's workshops and in cleared sections of jungle with groups of 10 and 20 and sometimes 50 people, and she taught them the fundamentals of what she knew, which was how to find the signal in the noise and how to build the thing that sends it out. On the day the council's diplomatic vessel finally departed orbit, Yaya was sitting on the same piece of broken concrete with the field guide and the same small, serious child, who had by now read the field guide 3 times and had strong opinions about which birds were the most interesting. "They're leaving," the child said, watching the vessel's drive signature fade against the stars. "For now. Will they come back?" "Yes. With more ships. Probably. And we'll fight them." Yaya looked at the organized stars. No, not organized. Not anymore. The relay stations were down. The council's grid was gone from this corner of the sky. The stars were scattered again, the way her grandmother had described them, loose and wild and countless, the way spilled salt looks against a dark table. "We'll be ready," she said. She put her cap on. The bird in its faded thread, the faded stripes, the rectangle of blue that nobody living could fully name anymore except as a symbol of something that had refused to finish being. The child leaned against her arm and looked at the guide. "Page 47, it said. "The swift. It says swifts spend almost their entire life in flight. They eat in the air and sleep in the air and they only land to nest. It says they can fly up to 10 months without touching the ground." "Yes." The child closed the book. It looked at the sky. "And then they come home," it said. Yaya did not answer. She was looking at the stars. In her chest the old splinter was gone. What had replaced it was not nothing. It was something still sharp, still aware of everything the calendar said had been lost, but it pointed in a different direction now, forward rather than inward. It felt like what it probably was, the first small architecture of something that intended to last. The swift lands to build the nest. They were home. There was work to do.